Hello, I'm Dennis. I'm one of the DCAs for WUDC 2026, and I'll be explaining the updates we've made to the manual surrounding actor motions. For Sofia Worlds, the CA team did a complete rewrite of the actor motions section. So this video will seek to walk you through what our section looks like now, with particular attention to where we feel the clarifications are the most substantial. As a brief agenda, I'll be talking about three things in today's video. First, how should judges evaluate what it means to persuade an actor in relation to conflicting reasons offered by teams in the round? Second, what does it mean to adopt the actor's perspective in an actor debate? And then finally, just touching on the clarification we've given on how to evaluate actor motions from the perspective of groups of people. But first, just a refresher on what we mean by actor motions. So, when we say actor motion, we're referring to motions that most commonly have the following structure. This house as A would do X. However, this is not the only formulation of an actor motion. We've also clarified that a motion worded this house would should also be treated as an actor motion if it contains an information slide describing the perspective of an actor, commonly starting with the words you are a blank. So for example, a motion like you are Bernie Sanders, this house would, or you are a parent in the US, this house would. These would also be considered actor motions as well. Additionally, some actor motions will be phrased this house as A supports X, or this house as A believes that, or this house as A prefers. And there are a variety of other structures that are similar to this as well. These motions should be set up in the same manner as the corresponding analysis motion. In other words, there is no fiat in these debates as they are not policy motions. However, arguments on these motions are evaluated under the rules pertaining to actor motions that I'll get into later. In case this isn't an exhaustive list of every potential formulation of an actor motion, a simple heuristic you can use is that an actor motion is any motion in which the language of the motion requires teams to consider the motion from the perspective of an actor, as opposed to most other motions where one considers what would be normatively best from a third-person perspective. To be clear, this does not mean that normative arguments should not be considered or that we should assume actors are solely self-interested, but rather that any argument, regardless of its nature, must be solely evaluated by how it aligns with the interests of the actor. So if the actor reasonably has interests, such as that they care about normative ends, then it would be totally legitimate for teams to make arguments about why a policy might be normatively good because the actor cares about normative goods. So, with that being said, the first thing I want to touch on is what does it mean to persuade an actor? An important clarification to note here is that actor motions are about what aligns with the actor's priorities and not about what an actor is likely to do. So, for example, if the motion was this house, as a chronic procrastinator, would do their work ahead of time, the fact that the actor has an established habit that they are likely to follow is not a relevant consideration in a debate, but with the course of action that would most conform with the actor's interests and preferences would be. It would not be legitimate for a team to say, given that you're a procrastinator and you have historically not done your work ahead of time, you are likely going to fall into old habits, because that isn't the question that the motion is asking. Therefore, when evaluating competing reasons given in a debate, judges should consider the actor's values, duties, and interests in order to determine which reason is most likely to be persuasive. I also want to note here that there is a distinction to be made between what we consider to be an actor's preferences, which can reasonably diverge from what we would consider to be utility maximizing or normative goods, and what could be fallacious reasoning. So, for example, the argument that an actor would prefer to do what the motion is asking of them because they're feeling the pressure of a sunk cost fallacy should not be considered persuasive, given that they are given the information that teams are offering them in the round. The fact that they have told them that this is a sunk cost fallacy would make it such that this wouldn't be something that they would find reasonable or persuasive. The second thing I want to touch on is what it means to adopt the actor's perspective. So Importantly, actors often have a multitude of preferences, often with varying levels of intensity and also often at odds with one another. So, for example, in the motion, this house, as a first generation Indian immigrant to the United States, would give their child an English name. It is plausible that the actor would not have a singular preference as their perspective. It is plausible, if not likely, that they would both have a preference for wanting their child to assimilate more easily, and also a competing preference for embracing their home country's culture, and the debate could likely force a trade-off between the two. At that point, then, it would be up to the judge to both consider the strength with which the actor holds either of these beliefs, and also the persuasiveness with which arguments interact with and might potentially sway the actor against those beliefs. So I want to note here, judges should not be evaluating arguments that are given against a static backdrop of their evaluation of the actor's preferences. They should also be evaluating arguments about what those preferences are and updating their model of the actor's worldview in real time. So, for example, in the motion I mentioned earlier, if the judge believes at the outset of the motion that the actor holds both of these opposing preferences with equal strength, like 50% for each, they should be willing to be persuaded by teams throughout the round that perhaps the balance is closer to 80-20 for one of these preferences. That one of these preferences, because of the specific situation that the actor is in, for example, would alter the extent to which they weigh one preference over the other. Probably just the most important thing to note here, though, is that we have added language to resolve the issue of how actor debates interact with the bounded knowledge of the actor. And this is really important. Teams cannot make arguments solely based off of an actor just not knowing a fact or having never heard of the underlying reasons or information that underlie the arguments teams are giving. Here's an example of the type of prevalent argument that I think we wanted to preclude with this section. Imagine the motion is this House, as a Republican voter, believes that tariffs should not be a part of the US foreign policy. And OO stands up and says, opening government is using an argument that they say is based in the Chicago School of Economics to explain why tariffs would not be in the actor's interests, given that they are a Republican voter who is in favor of free market policies. But you shouldn't credit this argument because the average Republican voter has likely not read or heard of the complex economic theories that underlie the Chicago School of Economics. At the point where a team's argument is made in the round, it enters information into the round that the actor is then made fully aware of. And I want to be clear here. Awareness of knowledge is not the same as belief in that knowledge. It is totally fine and well within the debate for teams to argue about the extent to which the actor accepts this knowledge. It may very well be true, for reasons given by opening opposition in the motion I mentioned earlier, that a Republican voter would hear this argument about tariffs and not find it persuasive. And it is fine to give arguments to explain why that's true. But it is just not within the ground of the debate for a debater to say, well, they just haven't heard of it. So this is not an argument that they would find relevant or would have come to mind. Additionally, the actor should be assumed to be fully capable of reasoning and to be operating free from manipulation. So, arguments that follow the structure, this argument is fallacious, but the actor is likely to believe it anyway because they are irrational or not particularly intelligent, are not arguments that should be credited. We should be assuming for the sake of the debate that the actor in the round is rational enough to accept the arguments without manipulation or needing to understand them at a certain level. The final thing that I want to talk about is actor motions about groups of people. So some actor motions will not just refer to an individual, but rather they'll refer to something like a country or a business or an organization. In these motions, it can sometimes be unclear what set of people are included within that group. So before I explain how we want to resolve this, I think a good step and what we want to strongly recommend to CA teams prior to, CA teams that are setting prep comps before Worlds, Avoid setting actor motions with ambiguous actors. So a motion that says, this house as China would implement a specific policy are motions where it's unclear what we mean by China. If it's the Chinese government or the Chinese people, that's not clear based on the motion. So instead, what we would want is for the CAs to explicitly clarify to the extent possible who is it that this group of people is that we're talking about. So going back to the China example, what we would say is something like if you wanted the motion to be from the perspective of the government, this house as the CCP. If you wanted it to be about the people who live there, this house as Chinese citizens or Chinese landowners. Uh, all of these would make it much clearer who the actor in this debate is, in order to avoid messy debates that are due to definitional ambiguity. However, where ambiguity over the actor still remains, what we want to clarify and to make it easier for these rounds to not devolve into questions about, who this actor is, opening government should have definitional fiat over who is included within that group. And as long as that definition is reasonable, judges and teams should accept it for the rest of the debate. So, for example, on the motion, this House, as Iran, supports a nuclear deal with the United States, opening government has the ability to define whether Iran, in this instance, refers to the government of Iran or the people of Iran as a whole, either of which would be reasonable definitions that the rest of the debate should cohere with. And just to kind of put you into the perspective of the CA team when we were working on this manual, while you might think that this was initially a settled question, that you might think, well, in my circuit, we have a pretty clear norm and understanding of what this house as China entails, upon discussion with one another, what we discovered was that what these motions asked of teams conflicted between different circuits and different individuals. So, given that Worlds is an international tournament, though we did not make a ruling, we decided to just encourage CA teams to use less ambiguous language. And in failing that, as a backstop, we wanted to clarify that OG should define it rather than clarifying here and forcing all circuits to do something that might be against what they have historically done.